Hi there, thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to be telling you how many times I've used each of my eyeshadow palettes, and I'm going to start from least to most used. Originally, I wanted to do a ranking eyeshadow palette video like I've been seeing go around on YouTube lately. I tried multiple methods. At the end of the day, I just feel like I feel the same about a lot of the palettes I own. I just really like them. So I figured instead of trying to rank them and not being super satisfied with the results, I thought I would just share my numbers with you. I have tracked how much I've used each of the eyeshadow palettes that I own. I've been tracking numbers for quite a few years now. Typically, I share how many uses it took to finish a makeup product in my series with the same name, but eyeshadow palettes I don't really use up on a regular basis, so there isn't really much of a chance for me to share those types of numbers with you, so I thought I'd do it today. I wanted to point out what constitutes a use, and for me that is just reaching for the palette in any capacity, even if I'm only using 1 to 2 shades. Because of my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, my habits of using just one eyeshadow palette per look has changed, and sometimes I'm reaching for anywhere from 3 to 5 palettes at any given time. So keep that in mind. My numbers are a little bit skewed and a little bit higher for each eyeshadow palette because I am more likely to reach for multiple palettes for my Pan Those Eyeshadows project. And before we get started, I do want you to pause this video and tell me in the comments, what do you think is my least used palette and which one do you think is my most used palette? And I do want to point out, very interestingly, that I thought I knew what my most and least used palette was, but when I went and actually looked at the numbers, I was wrong on both accounts. So anyway, let's get started with my least used eyeshadow palette. This one's a little bit embarrassing because I did buy it in the fall of last year and I've only used it 2 times, and that is the Urban Decay Born to Run palette. This is a beautiful palette. When I open it, I love the color story. This portion over here looks so beautiful, the greens and the oranges and the grays and blues, but for some reason I have not translated that into actually using it. And I'm hoping that I randomly choose one of the shades from this palette in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, and that'll give me an excuse to reach for it more. I can't even really tell you if the formula is that good because I haven't reached for a majority of the shades, and I've only used it twice in like the last 8 months. I think what happened is I purchased this right before I left for a 5-week trip, and then when I came back, I had another palette that I bought on that trip that I was focusing on, and then I had other shadows in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project that I wanted to wrap up and hit pan on before the end of the year. So just circumstances got out of my way and this kind of fell to the wayside, but I don't want to use that as an excuse, and hopefully I can just remember to reach for this more. My next 3 palettes I've only used 4 times. However, they are 3 of the newest palettes in my collection, so I don't really think that that's too much of an indicator of whether or not I like them. The first 2 palettes that I've only used 4 times are from ColourPop. This is the Going Coconuts palette and the It's My Pleasure palette. These were in a favorites bundle from Andrea Mattiano on the ColourPop website, and I think I bought these back in February or beginning of March. I recently did a ColourPop eyeshadow bingo video to reach for more of my ColourPop shades, and in that video I think I randomly selected 3 shades from this palette and 1 shade from this palette. I also featured the Going Coconuts palette in my 5 looks 5 palettes video that I recently did. I've only had them for a couple months, so I don't think 4 uses each is too bad. Whenever I do use these, I do use a majority of the shades from the palette. So I would say maybe 2 or 3 out of the 4 uses for each of these, I've used only this palette to create that look. Meaning I have reached for a majority, if not all of the shades from each palette. I like the color schemes, I like the packaging, I like the formula, and I do like the variety of shades that you get, even though these are monochromatic palettes. So I have no doubt that I'll be getting a lot more use out of these in the future. The next one is a dang shame because it's one of my favorite palettes that I own, and this is the Give Me Glow Juicy Olive palette. I love this palette, and I understand that there's not a ton of variety of looks that you can create with it because it is monochromatic and it has 6 shades of olive green, but I love the formula of this. I love olive greens on my eyes. I think it's a very flattering color scheme for me. I purchased these right at the tail end of last year, and I think I will be pulling for this a lot more maybe in the fall months, just because I feel like olives and darker greens and stuff are more fall in my head at least, but I definitely think I'll be getting a lot more use out of this palette in the future. My next palette I want to talk about is from Smashbox. It is the Vlada palette, and I have used this 30 times. And the majority of the times that I did use it was to try and hit pan on one of the shadows in here. This is a very monochromatic palette once again, but I do like the formula. It has a ton of really gorgeous pinky shimmers, which I do really like. For some reason, I just don't think to grab for this that often, but I do think it's a really good palette. And the next one I've used 33 times, and that is the Tarte Make Believe in Yourself palette. Both of the Tarte and the Vlada palette have mostly shimmers in them with only 1 or 2 mattes, and so they are companion palettes that I use with other palettes to create a look, unless I'm going for something like really simple with just a crease shade and something on the lid, which I don't do that often. I'm really glad I have this. I love this palette, and I wish Tarte would just bring this back and make it permanent because I think this is something that a lot of people would really enjoy. The next one up is another one of my newest palettes, and it is the Too Faced Bonbons palette. I bought this, I think, in November of last year, and I've used this 37 times. This is a really pretty, mostly cool-toned palette, and I do really like it. I wish I would think to use it more because I do think every time I use it, I create really pretty looks. It also smells like chocolate, which I really like. I have one pan in one of the shades, and I am currently working on another shade. Both of them were randomly selected in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, which I'm really happy when I do that because it gives me an excuse to reach for the palette more, and I think this is beautiful. I think this is also discontinued, which is a shame. And my last palette before we hit 50 plus uses is from Urban Decay. It's the Naked 3 palette. This is once again a monochromatic palette with mostly pinks and grays. And I love this color story. I love pinks and grays together. I think that's so pretty. I've used this 43 times. I do have pan in one of the shades. This is a palette that came out quite a few years ago, and I know that the formula from the Urban Decay palettes aren't considered to be as amazing as they were back in the day when there wasn't as much variety or options out there. Nowadays, lots of brands, including indie brands, come out with palettes that have fantastic formulas, and I don't think that this one competes with those, but I am still really glad I have it, and I think it's a good palette for me. Now for the 50 plus category, I'm going to be talking about products that I've used more than 50 times but less than 100 times, and I only have 2 palettes in that category. The next palette is one that I really love. It's one of my only colorful palettes that I own, and it is the Shroud Cosmetics Creepy Cute palette. This is a mostly pastel palette, and it's gorgeous. And I do have pan in 2 of the shadows. Funny story, I started my Pan Those Eyeshadows project in January of 2019, and I randomly selected 2 shades out of the 5 from this palette, which I didn't even have in my possession yet. It was still coming in the mail. So right as soon as I purchased it, I started using it immediately for that project. I wouldn't say I wear colorful pastels on an everyday basis, but this definitely serves a purpose in my collection, and this one I have used 52 times. The next one I have technically used a lot more than the other one, but I don't really love it as much. It's the e.l.f. Modern Metals palette. I have 2 pans in here, and I've used it 89 times. Some of these shades aren't really my favorite formula. These deeper mattes here, the purple and the blue, just aren't really that good. I think they're harder to formulate to begin with, and I just don't really love the formula. These shimmers are good. The medium mattes are nice too, but they're not super unique to my collection. I find myself not really loving this palette as much as I used to. Maybe I'm growing out of it, maybe the colors aren't really speaking to me as much anymore, I'm not really sure. But yeah, I just don't really feel super special about this palette, and if I were to rank my eyeshadow palettes from least favorite to most favorite, this one would probably be closer to the bottom. Now we are hitting 100 plus uses, and this next portion will be 100 uses to 150. The first palette in this category I want to talk about will be featured in my next Club 100 video because I only just used it for the 100th time today actually, and that is the Zoeva on Taupe palette. I do have 2 pans in here, and I really like this palette, and I really like the color scheme. I do like pinks and grays, and I really enjoy the formula. The mattes on here are super blendable and buttery. I wouldn't say the shimmers are the most blinding metallics out there, but I do have a place in my personal makeup routine for less metallic, less in-your-face shimmers like these, so it's fine. And I just really like this color story and the formula. The more I use this palette, the more I love it. My next palette is the one that I've actually had the longest. This is my oldest eyeshadow palette that I own. It's from Stila, and it is the Eyes Are the Window to the Soul palette. And I have used this 106 times. I do have 6 pans in here, and I think the main reason for that is because the pans are very, very thin, so it's relatively easy to hit pan on these shades. This is one of the first palettes I ever purchased, and I really love it. I love the color story. I love the color of the shimmers and the satins. I think the mattes are really pretty. They perform really nicely. This is getting up there in age. I know I should be more aware of the fact that I'm going to have to probably declutter it pretty soon, but I just don't want to. It's still in good condition in my opinion. I don't think the formula has changed drastically, and I just don't really want to part with it just yet, so I'm not going to. My next 2 palettes are from Milani. I have the Most Loved Mattes palette and the Bold Obsessions palette. I've used the Most Loved Mattes palette 119 times, and I do have 3 pans in here. And the Bold Obsessions palette I've used 125 times, and this has 4 pans. I think that these are both really nice builder palettes, especially the matte palette. With the Bold Obsessions, I do think that these shades are pretty. I think this Gold Getter shade is a little difficult to work with. It is a little bit chunky, and I have better performing golds in my collection. But I got each of these for $15, and I think they're good. The thing is, I like these palettes, but they're not ones that I feel like I would need to run out and repurchase if for some reason they disappeared. If I had to go out and start over, I don't think I would feel a compulsion to go out and purchase these right away to have them in my collection. They're nice to have, but they're not like my absolute favorite palettes in my collection. My next one is one of my favorite palettes in my collection, and I most likely would run out and repurchase if for some reason it disappeared, and that is the Colored Rain Queen of Hearts palette. I have 2 pans in here, and I've used this 138 times. I recently featured this in my 5 looks 5 palettes video, and I created a look with the more bronzy browns in here, and I just love this palette so much. I think full price it's $55, but Colored Rain does have sales pretty often. I know some people who have gotten it for as cheap as like $18. I think I paid $35 for mine. And this was one of the main temptations for my 2017 no buy. This came out and it was a limited edition palette, and I did worry that this wouldn't be available once my no buy ended, but luckily they did decide to make it permanent, and so I was able to get my hands on it the next year, and I'm really glad I did. I really like this palette. Alright, now we're in my top 3, and the third most used palette in my collection is from ABH, and it's the Sultry palette. This is the palette I brought with me when I went to Italy for 5 weeks last year, and I really wish ABH would make this permanent. I think it's a really nice addition to their collection. It's one of the more cool toned palettes that they offer. I have 7 pans in here, and I've reached for this palette 140 times. It is one of my favorites. I love it. I love the formula, and I'm just really glad I have this in my collection. My second most used eyeshadow palette is once again from ABH, and it is the Modern Renaissance palette. I purchased this right at the end of 2016. I've used this so much that the mirror has popped off of the packaging, so I have to remove it from the palette. I just need to get my hands on some super glue to super glue it back on. This Realgar shade is actually the orange I'm wearing on my eye today. It's one of my favorite shades from the palette. And every time I reach back into this palette, I think, why don't I use this more? I love it. I love the formula, I love the color story. I have 8 pans in here, and I've used it 152 times. And I thought this was my most used palette in my collection, but it's actually the one I'll be talking about next. That was very surprising, but I have used it quite a bit. I've used it 152 times. And my most used palette is from Tarte. It is the Tartelette in Bloom palette. I've used this 186 times, and I have 7 pans in here. And I really like this. I don't love the 2 or 3 shimmers in here. I think they're just okay, but I do really love the mattes in here. It smells like chocolate. It's a nice color story. The mattes are fantastic, and I just really like this palette. But I think this is just a really great companion palette, which is why I thought I used the Modern Renaissance more, because I would say I like the Modern Renaissance more than the Tartelette in Bloom. And I know Ulta will occasionally have sales where you can get this for like $25, so I would be on the lookout for that if you do want to get this palette. And even though I didn't realize it was my most used palette, it is definitely one that I knew was up there because I do really like it and I reach for it a lot. So that was an overview of how many times I've used each of my eyeshadow palettes. Tell me, were you surprised by the number, or did that seem like it was pretty on brand with how much I talk about and use each of the palettes in videos? Give me an idea of what your rankings would be. What are your least and most used eyeshadow palettes in your collection? But in the meantime, that's everything I have. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys!